Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
The light came into the world, but human beings loved darkness rather than light, because their deeds were wicked. Everyone who practices evil hates the light. They do not come near it for fear their deeds will be exposed.
Today on Reflections, Father Bacik talks with Sister Patricia Snap, who is Associate Professor of Literature at Siena Heights College. Father Bacik and Sister Snap will discuss the mercy of the Lord overcoming the darkness of sin. And now, here is Father Bacik.
Pat, I'd like to discuss with you a little bit a passage from John's Gospel, chapter 3. It occurs in verses 14 to 21. Jesus is talking to Nicodemus. It seems that in John's Gospel he takes particular encounters that Jesus has with people and then uses them as a way of letting Jesus give a speech about something, or letting Jesus tell his version of the way the kingdom is at work in the world. And so Jesus is talking to Nicodemus, and it's got to do with God's relationship with the world. He says things like God loved the world, sent his Son, and so on, that people might have eternal life. God didn't really want to condemn the world, and so on. And then it goes on to say the judgment in question is this: the light came into the world, but human beings loved darkness rather than light, because their deeds were wicked. Everyone who practices evil hates the light. They do not come near it for fear their deeds will be exposed. And that sort of sets the tone for what I would like to talk about, which has to do with the darkness of sin and our efforts to overcome it. Darkness is an interesting metaphor for sin, I think, and we might just explore that a bit. I'll bring out one notion. The Bible talks about sin in terms of blindness, about an inability to see God or to be able to see God's plan and so on. Do you want to comment a little bit about sin under that metaphor as darkness?
You know, of course, that since the civil rights movement, in fact, there has been a certain animosity on the part of our black sisters and brothers toward the identification of darkness and blackness with things that are negative and evil. And so we balance that off, I suppose, by saying that in many contexts, darkness is, of course, the context for beautiful. It was in the darkness of the night, for instance, that Christ was born, and so there is always this sense that it's an ambiguous term. But in relation,
I hadn't adverted to that. That's interesting. But darkness is a metaphor that can tell us of positive things as well as negative things. Do you have other positive examples?
Well,
darkness?
If you're operating in the black, that's good.
Well, yeah, but
much
you have
better than
darkness and black. Yeah, but I mean
Yeah.
darkness is a metaphor, lack of light.
I think we associate it with a sense of mystical relationship. We think of the night, the stars, a time when most of creation is sort of blotted out, and when, in a sense, our minds sort of leap toward the only thing we can see, which physically means that we look upward, and that in some sense we have a sense of heaven as being upward, so that we look heavenward, and we tend, and many people will say this, that they tend to somehow feel closer to God in those sorts of situations, walking at night and looking up at the stars and up at the sky.
Yes, and we, of course, have the classic phrase from John of the Cross, the dark night of the soul, which, while it is a moment of desolation, is also a moment of meeting with God.
That's right.
Where the revelation of God comes through in a special and distinct kind of way. So your point is well taken. Darkness is a metaphor that cuts two ways.
That's right.
But I'd like to talk about it in terms of sin in this passage that we see in John's Gospel here.
Well, we think of darkness, blackness, of an emptiness, an inability or an unwillingness to see something clearly. And it's a beautiful metaphor, and John uses darkness and light throughout his entire gospel, since he is probably of all the evangelists the most highly poetic. I think it's interesting to look at his sense of darkness, that we do deeds in the dark because we're afraid to bring them to the light. And I associate darkness, in a sense, in two time zones with sin. I think there's the darkness of the time when we actually sin. There is that maybe clouding of our minds. Certainly, we allow our wills to be darkened, I suppose, by some impulses, whether it's selfishness or greed or lust or sloth or whatever it might be. And so there is the darkness that occurs in us in some psychic way, I think, at the moment of sin.
Well, let's just stay with that. I mean, my own sense of that is that the mind sort of turns off, that it tunes out other signals, that it doesn't listen to anything else to shift the metaphor, or it doesn't let the light of what we traditionally call God's grace in at that moment. I think that's psychologically sound, the analysis that you have offered here. It seems to me there is a turning off or a certain darkness in the moment of doing something that we judge to be sinful.
It's interesting that we also associate reason with the light bulb, for instance, in cartoons. The light bulb, which suggests the idea that someone has gotten. Reason we think of as that which illuminates or ought to illuminate our actions and take precedence over passion, for instance. And yet, I like your sense that we can turn it off. We can very willfully turn off that light and refuse to allow reason to govern, to at some level say, I'm going to allow my passions to have sway here. I'm going to do what I want to do regardless of whether or not my mind is telling me that it's a wise or a good thing to do.
To bring out your sense of ambivalence again, I think there's probably a way in which passion is also illuminating, though.
That's right.
I mean, I don't like
That's
to
right.
set up a sharp dichotomy between reason and emotion and make reason be the good and emotion
the
be
bad
the
guy.
bad thing.
That's right.
Because I think that very often passion is illuminating. In other words, we say unless one is really concerned or involved or caring, that one can't appreciate the situation or the people or the consequences, the circumstances that you find yourself in. So there's a way in which passion is also illuminating. But that's not to take away your point, which I really buy. There is a clicking off or a turning off of a light, I think, in the moment of sinfulness.
And then I think as we refuse either to acknowledge our sin, or we find ourselves unable to deal with it honestly and realistically, to confess perhaps, to acknowledge it to a friend, we can bury it, and then I think guilt is sort of the continuing darkness in a sense. It's the back room in our minds, which somehow may obsess us and certainly is going to discomfort us, but that is the continuing effects of sin which has not been dealt with properly and brought to the light, so that in Martin Luther King's image, like a boil, it can be opened and then possibly healed.
I've heard people use that image of guilt being like a dark cloud that they feel over them or over their left shoulder or engulfing them in one way or another. Again, that image of darkness. So it's not just in the act of sin, but in the consequences as well. And I noticed that you were relating it to the inability, therefore, to look at it, to examine it, to bring it into the light, which takes us back to the biblical notion everyone who practices evil hates the light, doesn't come near it, because somehow the light would expose the truth of the deeds. The light would help us see what they were really all about, the kind of selfishness, self-centeredness that would be involved in those sinful actions. So it would be painful in a way to deal with that kind, with guilt, as you were saying.
That's right. I think it's painful, and I think we have a deep sense of shame around things that we feel guilty about. And we somehow, I think, all of us, I do, fear risking what shall I say, risking maybe my reputation or perhaps the good opinion someone has of me. And so I shy away from saying, I have done this thing. This is, eating at my soul. I feel very bad about this because I fear that I will shock someone who likes me or turn the person off and lose that person's goodwill and possibly friendship. I think this is just one of the very human reasons we do often tend to bury those very things about ourselves that need most to be expressed.
Yeah, I mean, you express that very personally, and in doing so, I mean, I think you speak a universal truth, something that everybody can understand and feel, that good opinion of others, you use the word reputation and so on, that our standing with others can be brought into question by talking about dealing with our sinfulness, the culpable actions that we may have committed that are against our conscience. And I was thinking of it in those terms, too, that there's sort of a darkness of self-betrayal that's involved in sinfulness. I'm a little hard-pressed to say exactly how that plays out in my mind, but I suppose it's like saying, well, I didn't live up to my ideals. The light that is there from my high standards, or what I'd like to be, how I'd like to be thought of, has gotten overcome by the darkness. I've betrayed something, and to me that is a darkness. It cuts off something that ought to be there, or that one cherishes and treasures, which is sort of an illumination of feeling good about oneself and so on. That's vague to me, but self-betrayal says something about sinfulness to me.
And I think because self-betrayal takes such a toll on us psychologically, I think self-betrayal leads very directly towards self-contempt and self-hatred, that we punish ourselves probably vastly more than anybody else or any court would ever punish us for the things that we do. Just even dwelling on our mistakes, rethinking them is a way of sort of, in one sense almost torturing ourselves, an inability to let go and put into the hands of God with a trust in God's forgiveness.
I was thinking of another way in which I think that the darkness takes over, and that is that we've traditionally said that sin cuts you off from the community. So sin isn't just a refusal to love God or separating oneself out or culpably hurting others, but it does have an effect, a ripple effect on the whole community, and a negative kind of effect. And it also, in turn, means that we're separated out, that we're cut off from the body in some way, because we've betrayed that larger grouping. And therefore, I see a darkness about all of that. It's the darkness of isolation, of aloneness. You think of the early church and the practice of putting the sinners outside and not letting them be there for the communion and sharing fully in the Eucharist. And that's a very dark, isolating kind of experience. It was meant to be that, to point out the social character of sin, that it harmed the total group, and therefore one needed to be reconciled with the group before one could move forward and enjoy the illumination that comes from community life. So I'm associating darkness here with isolation.
I think there's also the inner isolation, not only the outer isolation from the community, but the inner isolation that maybe works something like this. People think that I am one with them, but I am different. I have done these things. I am guilty of whatever it might be, and they do not know it. And so although maybe I'm mingling with them, I sense that I am somehow unclean, apart. I am the leper in their midst, but they don't know it. And again, until somehow that sin can be brought to the light in one of many, many ways, I suppose, the inner isolation also is operative and separating.
That's a penetrating insight in my mind, because I think that's exactly what we still do. Mingle, of course. We don't cut people off from the community or send them out. People still live in their families and go to church in their congregations and join with their others at work and so on. So there's still the mingling, but there's not the kind of community that one would like. The darkness takes one over, and it's all from within. It's I don't fit in, and then people get defensive and so on. We have a lot of problems that result from that. So I believe that is, your point there is well taken and on target. I was thinking of culturally, we can't really speak of sin very much. And I was thinking, we had that book, Whatever Became of Sin, by Carl Menninger,
right,
that many people have heard of, and I often mention. And he castigated the clergy for not talking about sin. I was comparing it with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who also castigated the clergy for not dealing with death, and said, that the religious communities don't face up to death. And she was able to turn that around so that we have death and dying courses now. We have clergy visiting the hospitals and allowing people to talk about death. It's become much more of an open topic than it was before, it seems to me. But Carl Menninger was less successful than Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Menninger said, let's talk about sin, but at least in many circles, that really remains a taboo topic, perhaps especially in educated circles where it is considered to be gauche or passé, unenlightened to speak about sin. One could speak about neuroses or psychoses or mental imbalances, but certainly not about sin as any culpable disregard of divine law or of blameworthy refusal to love other people. So Menninger really has not succeeded in turning that around, and I think it really is a problem area for us. We suffer because of it.
Yeah, I think there are two things operative here. One is our euphemizing tendencies in the culture, not to call a spade, as it were, but to call it anything else, not even often to use the word death, but passed away. I think the other is, certainly our strong tendency to psychologize away all of our human actions in terms of, events in our childhood that we had no control over, or interactions with people that perhaps we couldn't entirely control. And to some extent, I think we have taken away the sense that we do have a certain autonomy in our actions, that certainly much of what we do is within our power to control through what we call our human wills. And I think the psychologizing tendency can, in a sense, negate that we do, in fact, have some sort of autonomous ability.
Right. The Freudian revolution has been brought a lot of illumination, but I think certain areas it's left in the dark, and I think that sinfulness is one of those. Pat, I think that we should look a little bit at the Scriptures, because our great claim as Christians and members of the Judeo-Christian tradition is that the Holy Writings tell us something about the human condition and help us to deal with all of that. And again, a problem comes to my mind, and that is that when we begin to look at sinfulness, there is a sort of dark side in the Scriptures, a heavy-handed side when we look at God. Let me just talk about a passage from the second book of Chronicles, chapter 36. And it's talking about how the people, the Israelites, the priests, the people, the princes have been piled infidelity upon infidelity. In other words, they're really practicing abominations and so on. And when God looks down, sends messengers, tries to get them to shape up, but despite all of his warnings, the people scoff at his prophets and they don't do anything about it. And then the book of Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, goes on to say the anger of the Lord against his people was so inflamed that there was no remedy. This is harsh talk. Then he brought up against them the king of the Chaldeans, who slew their young men in their own sanctuary building, sparing neither young men nor maiden, neither the aged nor the decrepit. He delivered all of them into his grip. Finally, their enemies burnt the house of God down, tore down the walls of Jerusalem, set the palaces afire, and destroyed all of its precious objects. So we get, a notion of God's anger blazing up here, and tearing down and then slaying the people. It's really harsh imagery. And I'm afraid you could multiply examples of that in the Scriptures. And I think that what happens with some people, at least in the Judeo-Christian tradition, is they latch on to those phrases. They don't see them in any larger context of a God of mercy. And thus we get even a heavier moralizing. So, boy, I better not look at this sin, the darkness of sin. I better stay in the darkness, because you've got a God who slays people for this, whose anger blazes up. And I think an overemphasis on that heavy side of the Scriptures has made it even more difficult to deal with the darkness of sin.
I've often thought that, redemption aside, and of course I'm smiling as I'm saying redemption aside, that perhaps the most important thing Jesus did in his life was to maybe reshape the concept of God for the people to whom he preached, from the God who is a God of mercy but also of vengeance, to the God that we see in the parable of the prodigal son, for instance. Again and again, the mercy of God is stressed. Again and again, for the sinners, Jesus has only forgiveness and words of peace. And I think if the redemption were not necessary, that perhaps it was necessary in the history of the evolution of the world for us to have a more hopeful sense of this God, this source of our life, the source of our future, that we call our Father, and that's perhaps one of the great benefits for us who live after Christ has come over the Jews.
But you find that even among the Israelites, it's interesting. The passage I was reading you from the 36th chapter of 2 Chronicles, at one point the theory is it was the end of the Hebrew canon, of the holy books, and it ended in a very heavy kind of note. The author goes on to talk about Cyrus, the king of Persia, who is really a servant of God, even though he's a pagan, and he's the one who frees the Israelites from the Babylonian exile and sends them back. And then comes a phrase which is quoted from another part of the Scriptures, and in other words, to give this hopeful ending to the whole Hebrew canon, the listing of the sacred books, goes on, "Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, all the kingdoms of the earth, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given to me, and he has also charged me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever therefore among you belongs to any part of his people, let him go up, and may his God be with him." So the people are in darkness. They're in exile. They've been punished by God for their terrible crimes, for not listening to him, for turning back the messengers. But the ending becomes again the moment of hope. So Jesus, in bringing that out to us, is really building on elements within his own Scriptures, the Hebrew tradition that he knew. "Whoever therefore among you belongs to any part of his people, let him go up, and may his God be with him." Let him go back to Jerusalem, back to where he can worship, to be with his people, back into the community of light. I think it is a marvelous message of hope there. And so that Jesus, I think, is building in when you were talking about the redemption and his image of God that he brought us, I think he was able to find elements of that right within his own tradition.
Oh, I agree. I think it's simply a matter of emphasis and focus. The second reading as well speaks of God as rich in mercy, and we have beautiful lines from the Hebrew Scriptures on God's mercy being above all his works. As I said, I think it's a matter of emphasis and focus in our own human tendency to see any sort of hardship, to give it a religious interpretation, to assume that somehow God is clobbering us for the evil things that we have done, for our deeds of darkness.
Whereas the Lord has given us another image. I was talking about John chapter 3, verses 14 to 21, and Jesus starts out, speaking to Nicodemus, and the image he gives him, he says, "Just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the desert, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that all who believe may have eternal life in him." So he goes back to his Hebrew roots, he sees that the story where the people were bitten by the serpents, but then by raising up the sign of the serpent, the brazen serpent, then the people would just gaze on that, look at that, they would be healed. And so we have that image then, I think, of Jesus turning it around. We have the devotion of looking at the cross. The cross being a sign of degradation in many ways, and betrayal, and of the darkness of sin really sort of the kingdom of darkness taking over and grasping Jesus and carrying him down to the netherworld, to Sheol, to hell, but that's also being the very instrument of redemption, of being lifted up and being brought into the light. So that redemptive notion, I think, is crucial here to dealing with sin. Of course, the upshot of this is that if indeed there is redemption like that, if God so loved the world, cares for all of us, that then indeed we ought to be able to look at our own sinfulness. That's one of the reasons it's good news. It says, hey, it's all right. It's okay. I know there's this darkness, and I know that you feel bad and that you have betrayed yourself and feel cut off and isolated internally and externally, but it's all right because there is redemption, there's grace, there's forgiveness. That is the good news of the gospel.
I think in our Catholic tradition that's also one of the psychological and theological reasons why our practice of confession is very important. Because certainly Mary Magdalene and the many sinners who went to Jesus in his own day all received forgiveness, but their hearts were disposed before they got there. But the importance was in hearing the words of forgiveness. I think the importance is in being able to verbalize our brokenness, our darkness, bring it to the light of day, and then allow the priest in the confessional, the spiritual counselor, the close friend, the one who will listen to us respectfully and reverently and carefully, and then can say, but you are still lovable, you are forgiven. That as humans, it's very important for us to hear that.
Yeah, the hearing of it, the visibility of it, the definiteness of it seems so important. That's why it's important for us to go back, I think, to these words of Jesus when he's talking to Nicodemus, and it stands there as a strong statement. He talks about the people who hate the light, don't come near it, and so on. But then he goes on, but he who acts in truth comes into the light to make clear that his deeds are done in God, so that the light brings us truth, helps us to understand ourselves better. And the Scriptures become part of that verbalization for us, that more positive sense of saying, no, you can bring your sins out of the darkness because there is mercy and forgiveness.
I think it's interesting that Nicodemus went to Jesus by night. He apparently did not want to be seen. And maybe there was just a little tiny touch of irony in what Jesus is saying there. Assuming that this is a literal transcription,
I never thought
of course.
It that way, yeah. Well, it's clearly, as you pointed out,
right.
in John's poetic sense, there is
That's
that interplay
right.
between the light
Constantly.
and the darkness, right?
Yeah.
Pat, there's a section in Paul's letter to the Ephesians, or one of Paul's disciples who probably wrote that, chapter 2, verses 4 to 10, that says, God is rich in mercy because of his great love for us. He has brought us to life with Christ when we were dead in sin. A God rich in mercy. You have just a few seconds. You want to comment on that image at all? A God rich in mercy?
I suppose mercy has come to be the attribute that, not just because I'm a sister of mercy, of course, but the attribute of God that gives me the most consolation and the most hope as I grow older and walk through life. And it has taken on new meaning for me as I look around at a world that is so much more broken than it appeared to me when I was young, and maybe greater darkness about the reality of pain and sin in the world.
And so that image becomes really crucial when we begin to think about the extent of the darkness and the power of the darkness. Pat, we've been talking about sin as darkness, and especially the effort to overcome it, because finally the Judeo-Christian message is positive. The gospel is good news. It says that God is a forgiving God, and that we can look at our sinfulness because we truly do believe that God is rich in mercy.
You've been listening to Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo. Today, Father Bacik talked with Sister Patricia Snapp, who is Associate Professor of Literature at Siena Heights College. The topic of this week's Reflections was the mercy of the Lord, overcoming the darkness of sin. If you have any comments on today's show or suggestions for future programs, please write Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Minister, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio 43606. Funding for this program was provided by the Catholic Communications Commission of the Diocese of Toledo.